Daniel chapter 11 covers the 5-month-long hour of temptation, beginning with verse 21, where we see the vile person, that's Satan, and once Satan and his angels are cast from heaven to the earth, the 5 months begin. As we know from Daniel 7, Daniel's fourth beast is exclusively supernatural. You have to have that supernatural ingredient for the 5 months to begin, and that one world political system to emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet. That's when Satan confirms the covenant with many for 1 week. It was a week of years, 7 years that is to say, but as we know from Revelation chapter 9, it's been shortened to a 5-month period. 2.5 month periods with Satan appearing as Antichrist in the middle, and we see that in Daniel 11:31, where we see the abomination that maketh desolate. This is what Christ spoke of in Matthew 24 and Mark 13, when Satan appears in Jerusalem as the false Christ in the middle of that 5-month-long hour of temptation, in the midst of it. After the deadly wound to the one-world political system, Satan appears as Antichrist, and then it becomes a one-world religious system. And as you can see from Daniel chapter 11, verses 31 through 39, it gets all religious. For example, the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, claiming to be God, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, those that came before him, that is to say, nor the desire of women, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He exalts himself above all that is called God or worshipped, as Paul wrote in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, that's himself, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God himself. See how it got all religious all of a sudden, as opposed to verses 21 through 30. So there you have the political in 21 through 30, the first 2.5 months. Then the one-world political system is wounded to death. Then Satan appears as Antichrist, and it becomes a religious one-world system for the remaining 2.5 months. Then we come to Daniel 11:40, and this is where the subject changes. And at the time of the end, the last day of the 5 months, I believe, this is a hypothesis, and this is an appendix to the Daniel 11 hypothesis. At the time of the end, the last day of the 5 months, shall the king of the south, that's Jacob, the Christian nations, push at him, and the him there is the Antichrist, and the king of the north, Esau, that is to say, shall come against him, Jacob, like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he, the true Christ, shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Who is our Passover? The true Christ. So you've got 4 written of here: the king of the south, Jacob, the Christian nations; the king of the north, Esau, the non-Christian communistic nations; Antichrist, which is Satan; and the true Christ, the Lord Jesus Christ, who returns at the last day of the 5-month-long hour of temptation, and that's when the 1,000 years begin. The true Christ shall enter into the countries, this is when he returns, and shall overflow and pass over. Christ is our Passover, as we know from 1 Corinthians chapter 5. He, the true Christ, shall enter also into the glorious land, Jerusalem, and many countries shall be overthrown, as we know from Daniel chapter 2, that stone destroys Satan's one-world system, and all nations are done away with, being replaced with the kingdom of God. Why would it be speaking of Antichrist entering into the glorious land all the way in verse 41? We already covered that in Daniel 11:31, remember? But these shall escape out of his, Jacob's, hand. Even Edom, called Gog in Ezekiel chapter 38, is the head of communism, and Moab and Ammon are the 2 wings of the Communist Party. This is when Jacob's yoke is broken from Esau's neck, as promised in Genesis 27, because Esau will be destroyed from being a nation forever. That's when Genesis chapter 27, verses 39 and 40 are finally fulfilled, as it's written in the Interlinear Bible, which is a better translation. Behold, your abode shall be from the fat of the earth, and from the dew of the heaven above. And you shall live by your sword. Look at the hammer and sickle, that's their symbol. And you shall serve your brother. And when it shall be that you fight, whenever he comes against the Christian nations, as we know from Ezekiel 38, that will happen at the very end, you shall break his yoke from your neck, because that's when he's destroyed from being a nation, as it's written in Obadiah as well, by those great hailstones that rain down from God out of heaven and destroy Edom forever. They'll go through the millennium, the 1,000 years, in spiritual bodies, but communism will be done away with forever and ever, is what's being said there. No more one world system, only the kingdom of the Lord Jesus Christ. That stone you can read of in Daniel chapter 2. Verse 42 of Daniel chapter 11, He, the true Christ, shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. And as it's written in Exodus chapter 7 verse 5, And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch forth mine hand upon Egypt and bring out the children of Israel from among them. And in the futurist sense, Egypt being symbolic of bondage, but Egypt the nation literally you'll find written of in Isaiah chapter 19 beginning with verse 18. In that day, the day of the Lord, the 1,000 years, shall 5 cities in the land of Egypt speak the language of Canaan and swear to the Lord of hosts. One shall be called the city of destruction. In that day shall there be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar at the border thereof to the Lord. And it shall be for a sign and for a witness unto the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt, for they shall cry unto the Lord because of the oppressors, and he shall send them a Savior, the true Christ, at the 7th trumpet, and a great one, and he shall deliver them. And the Lord shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know the Lord in that day, the day of the Lord, and shall do sacrifice and oblation, yea, they shall vow a vow unto the Lord, and perform it. And the Lord shall smite Egypt, he shall smite and heal it, and they shall return even to the Lord, and he shall be entreated of them, and shall heal them. But he, the true Christ, now we're back in Daniel 11, verse 43, but he, the true Christ, is who we're talking about here, shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts, as it's written in Haggai, chapter 2, verse 8, and over all the precious things of Egypt. And the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps, Jacob's steps, steps meaning the entrance into North America, Alaska, that is to say, as in Ezekiel 38, where the Libyans and Ethiopians are confederate with Esau. But tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, Antichrist, that is to say, and northeast of Jerusalem is what? Alaska. That's where they'll enter into the mountains of Israel, but they'll be pummeled with hailstones coming out of heaven from God, being destroyed, and they'll radio back to Jerusalem. These are the tidings out of the northeast that shall trouble Satan. Therefore he, Satan, shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. Now we're talking about the Battle of Armageddon, as we can read of in Revelation chapter 19, where the beast and his armies go to war against the true Christ and his armies. And this is when Satan's role of Antichrist and his one world system are destroyed in the lake of fire forever and ever. You can read of this in Revelation chapter 19. Verse 45, the last verse of Daniel 11, and he, the true Christ, that is to say, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. The millennial temple is what this is talking about. Why would it be saying that Satan would plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain? That already happened all the way back in verse 31. Yet he, Antichrist, Satan, shall come to his end. His role of Antichrist will be destroyed forever and ever along with this one world system, and none shall help him. And then if you were to go into chapter 12, you would see there Michael, and that's most likely who locked Satan up in the bottomless pit, as you can read of in Revelation chapter 20. That's when the day of the Lord begins. So all this happens at the time of the end, going back to verse 40. At the time of the end, the last day of the 5 months, in my opinion, again, this is a hypothesis, look into it, shall the king of the south, Jacob, that is to say, push at him, the Antichrist, and the king of the north, Esau, shall come against him, Jacob, like a whirlwind with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he, the true Christ, shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Who is the Passover? The true Christ. There you have it. The true Christ doesn't return until the last day of Satan's tribulation. And he, to repeat verse 45, the true Christ shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he, Antichrist, shall come to his end, Satan's role of Antichrist and his one world system being destroyed by the brightness of the coming of the true Christ, and none shall help him. And there you have it. There's the first appendix to the Daniel 11 hypothesis. Daniel chapter 11, verses 21 through 30 cover the first 2.5 months of the 5-month-long hour of temptation. Verses 31 through 45 cover the remaining 2.5 months and end with the 7th trumpet sounding and the return of the true Christ. And we can see in Daniel 9:27 where it reads, "And he, Satan, whenever he's cast from heaven to the earth and his angels are cast out with him at the beginning of the 5 months, shall confirm the covenant with many." This is that first beast of Revelation chapter 13, the one world system, the one world political system, for 1 week. Now that was 7 years, but it's been shortened to 5 months, as we know from Revelation chapter 9. And in the midst of the week, now the middle of a 5-month period, not 7 years anymore, but in the midst of the 5 months, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it desolate, because he's the desolator. This is when he appears as the false Christ in the middle of that 5-month-long hour of temptation. So with that in mind, let's now go to Daniel chapter 11 and verse 31. This is the 6th seal, the 6th trumpet, and the 6th vial, when Satan appears as the false Christ in Jerusalem. "An arm shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate." This is when Satan appears as the false Christ, and this marks the midst of Daniel's 70th week, as Bullinger notes in the Companion Bible. But it's not a week of years anymore. The 7 years have been shortened to a 5-month period. "And such as do wickedly against the covenant that he made with many, shall he corrupt by flatteries." In other words, anybody that was coming against the one world political system, he'll deceive into thinking he's Christ returned. And that's when it goes from a one world political system to a one world religious system. Because as it's written in Revelation 13, that's when Satan appears as Antichrist and heals the deadly wound to the one world political system. "He shall corrupt them by flatteries, by deception, claiming to be Christ returned, and he's supernatural, performing miracles in his role of Antichrist. But the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits." Those of the 7,000 Zadok are 232 of that number, possibly being the only ones not deceived at 666 initially, are delivered up, just as we saw a type of in Daniel chapter 3. And it's at that time the Holy Spirit speaks through them, bringing the 144,000 as well as whosoever will out of the deception, whereby they can repent and be grafted back onto God's family tree, which is the tree of life, the many-membered body of the true Christ, causing the same chain reaction you can read of in the book of Acts. But those with the seal of God in their forehead know what's really going on. The people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. "And they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, by captivity and by spoil many days." Now who are the they that shall fall here? Not they that understand among the people, but the many that they instruct. Regardless of their instruction from the word of God, they shall fall. They shall be deceived by the sword that comes out of Satan's mouth, the deception, and by flame, that fire, smoke, and brimstone that you can read of in Revelation chapter 9, by captivity, as it's written in Revelation 13, a captivity of the mind when they receive that mark of the beast in their forehead, and by spoil, their minds will be taken over with Satan's deception many days, 2.5 months. It was 42 months, as we know from Revelation 13, but it's been shortened to 2.5 months once Satan appears as the false Christ. Now when they shall fall, they shall be holpen with a little help. What God says through the elect, as you can read of in Matthew chapter 24 and Mark 13, that's the help that's being spoken of here. Many will wake up out of their stupor, out of their strong delusion, and come out of the confusion, come out of Babel, and take part in the first resurrection. But many shall cleave to them with flatteries, those that are deceived because of the peer pressure. Everyone won't come out of the confusion. And remember that what we're talking about here in verses 31 through 45, the remaining verses of Daniel chapter 11, are the consumer stage of the locust army. You had the first 3 stages in verses 21 through 30, the gnawer, the swarmer, and the devourer. And here in verse 31, going up to verse 45, you have the consumer stage of the locust army, which are exclusively Satan's fallen angels that are cast out with him at the beginning of the 5 months, which is when Satan confirms the covenant with many, the covenant of a one-world system. Verse 35, and some of them of understanding shall fall, shall waver, that is to say, this speaks of the 144,000, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. But it's for a purpose, to try them and to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end. They will overcome, as we know from Revelation chapter 14. The 144,000 being the first fruits of this world age, the 7,000 very elect, chosen from before the foundation of the world, were the first fruits of the first world age. Verse 36, and the king of Babylon of the end times, Babylon means confusion, shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, as it's also written in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. There'll be no gathering back to Christ until the son of perdition, Satan, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, against our heavenly Father, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. He shall speak great things and blasphemies, as it's written in Revelation 13, where it's also written that power was given him to continue 42 months, now 2.5 months, but the key word there is continue, meaning he was already on earth in a position of power 2.5 months before he appeared as Antichrist. You'll notice in Revelation 13 it says that the political beast was given his seat and power and great authority by the dragon, which is Satan. It's one of his roles. Verse 37, neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, his predecessors, that is to say, nor the desire of women, and in the context this is speaking of other gods, things that are worshipped, nor regard any god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Again, 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and this is himself. What did it just say? He exalts himself above all that is called God or worship, and a God whom his fathers, his predecessors, those who reigned before him, that is to say, knew not, shall he honor with gold and silver and with precious stones and pleasant things. Never before has there been a supernatural entity performing miracles made ruler over a one-world system. And people will think that he's Christ returned because they're biblically illiterate. Verse 39, to complete this appendix, thus shall he do in the most strongholds with the strange God, which is himself. Again, he exalts himself above all that is worshipped or called God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them, the 10 kings, the 10 fallen angel kings, that came into power at the beginning of that 5-month-long hour of temptation. They reign 1 hour with the beast, both during the political and the religious. And he shall cause them to rule over many in the one-world religious system, with no opposition like before, which caused the deadly wound, and shall divide the land for gain. Speaking of his one-world religious system, having 7 heads and 10 horns, no longer a political system as in the first half hour, that was wounded to death. Then he appeared as Antichrist, and it became a one-world religious system. So there you have it, the second appendix to Daniel chapter 11. Daniel 11 verses 21 through 30 cover the first half hour of the 5-month-long hour of temptation. That is to say, the first 2.5 months, with Satan not appearing until the woe of the 6th trumpet as Antichrist. So here we'll be covering, as best we can, what transpires at the woe of the 5th trumpet. So with that having been said, Daniel 11 verse 21. In his estate, in the estate of the one who sent out a raiser of taxes, and inasmuch as we're about to cover the one-world political system in verses 21 through 30, it makes sense in my mind that verse 20 is the United Nations, set up by the Kenites in 1945 after the Second World War, so this political system in verses 21 through 30 will replace that. In his estate shall stand up a vile person, and this is of course Satan, having been cast from heaven to the earth along with his angels at the woe of the 5th trumpet. Satan and his angels being Daniel's 4th beast, the supernatural element of the 7-headed beast of Revelation 13 that has 10 horns, which are the 10 fallen angel kings written of in Daniel 7. And in Revelation 17 it says that these 10 fallen angel kings reign 1 hour with the beast, which is the hour of temptation, temptation, which was 7 years, but as we know from Revelation 9, it's been shortened to a 5-month period. So again, in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. They shall not give him the honor of the kingdom yet. The dragon gives the first beast his power and seat and great authority. And this word flatteries means deception, something very slippery if you look up the word in your Strong's Concordance. And you'll remember in Revelation 9, which covers the woe of the fifth trumpet, after Satan is cast from heaven unto the earth, he opens the bottomless pit, and the sun and the air are darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit, the deception. And that's when these locusts come out of the smoke of the pit. They don't come out of the pit. They're cast out of heaven unto the earth because they're Satan's angels. They come out of the smoke of the pit, out of the deception. Satan's angels in 4 stages, and we'll see the gnawer, the swarmer, and the devourer in the first half in verses 21 through 30, and the consumer stage once Satan appears as Antichrist at the woe of the 6th trumpet, which is covered starting with verse 31 and going up to the end of the chapter. Verse 22, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overflown from before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. And this prince of the covenant is most likely the king of the south, the lion of Daniel chapter 7, that is to say, Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh, the Christian nations. This is the covenant with many for 1 week of Daniel chapter 9, verse 27. Satan makes a covenant of a one-world peace system for 7 years, but it's been shortened to 5 months. And when we compare this 22nd verse of Daniel chapter 11 to Revelation 12 verse 15, it becomes obvious that Daniel 11:22 is looking forward to what happens at 666 rather than what happens during that first half hour, which is for the most part what Daniel 11:21 through 30 has to do with. The time, times, and half a time written of in Revelation chapter 12 verse 14 being that first 2.5 months of the 5-month-long hour of temptation, now that the 7 years have been shortened, with Revelation chapter 12 verse 15 not happening until Satan appears as Antichrist at 666, which isn't until verse 31 of Daniel chapter 11. Verse 23, and after the league made with him, remember they called it the covenant of the League of Nations when they first attempted a one-world political system at the end of the First World War, and then you had the Second World War, followed by the United Nations, but we just saw the covenant mentioned in verse 22, and now here it says, and after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with the small people, the Kenites, and their 4 hidden dynasties of education, economics, politics, and religion, the infrastructure of this one-world political system, and the leopard of Daniel chapter 7, the Kenites and the 4 hidden dynasties. So the covenant of the League of Nations, followed by the UN, but only at the woe of the 5th trumpet does one-worldism finally emerge. Will it be due to the vehicles of the fallen angels and a visible external threat that all nations will come together in this one-world system? Possibly. We don't know that yet either. But as it's written in Revelation 9, the fallen angels' wings sound like chariots of many horses running to battle. So time will tell. Just something to think about. Verse 24, he shall enter peaceably at a time of supposed world peace, even upon the fattest places of the province, taking over. The dragon gave the beast his power and seat and great authority. You'll see that word seat mentioned again in Revelation 16 concerning the 5th vial, which is the deadly wound, and we'll cover that in this chapter as well. He shall enter peaceably even upon the fattest places of the province, of the planet, that is to say, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers, his predecessors, that is to say. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil, and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. His devices of deception, setting people up for the mark of the beast at 666. That deception being carried out by the locust army in the first 3 stages. Remember, it says in Revelation 9 that their torment was as the torment of a scorpion, which doesn't kill you immediately, but kills you in stages. And there are 4 stages of the locust army, with the first 3 occurring, in my opinion, in the first 2.5 months. And then it goes on to say, even for a time, and in verse 25, something goes wrong with this wonderful one-world system, and he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south, that's the lion of Daniel chapter 7, the Christian nations with a great army, and this great army here probably will consist of not only his locust army, spiritually speaking, but also with the deception of the small people through the four hidden dynasties, the Kenites, that is to say, and no doubt the bear as well, the king of the north, the bear from Daniel chapter 7, Esau. So how physical of a war is this? We don't know, but it is an altercation. And these days you can have an altercation politically, economically, religiously especially, and even we see cyber war going on nowadays. So there's all sorts of ways this can happen, but regardless, it's an altercation and a deadly wound to the one world system. And the king of the south, the Christian nation, shall be stirred up to battle with a very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him through their devices of deception. Yea, they that feed on the portion of his meat shall destroy them. And America feeds the world. Who is this that feeds on the portion of his meat? That would be everyone, wouldn't it? Not just physically, but spiritually as well. What is the meat really? Talking about the Christian nations here. And Jacob received the blessings, whereas Esau and Cain received curses. Remember from the book of Genesis? Only Jacob walked away with the blessing, and only a Christian nation can receive that blessing. His army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain. And this word slain, as you can see in your Strong's Concordance, means deadly wounded. And both of these kings' hearts shall be to do mischief, the king of the south and the king of the north, that is to say, the Christian nations, which are the lion, and the non-Christian nations, which are the bear. And they shall speak lies at one table, trying to diplomatically heal the deadly wound, evidently, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed. It's Satan's appearance as Antichrist at 666 that heals the wound, so to speak, and that's when it goes from being a global political system to a global religious system. At the sixth seal, the sixth trumpet, and the sixth vial. Then shall he return to his own land with great riches to appear as Antichrist in Jerusalem, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant, Christianity itself, and he shall do exploits and return to his own land, the land of Israel being called his land because it's the land of his children, the Kenites, ever since 1948. At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, which is symbolic of Christianity, but it shall not be as the former, that is to say politically, during the beginning of the 5 months, or as the latter, violently, when he sends the Ezekiel 38 confederacy against the mountains of Israel at the end of the 5 months, which is when the true Christ returns with the armies of heaven. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him, and with the 1,260 days of the testimony of the two witnesses, who are most likely Moses and Elijah, being shortened to 75 days, their prophesying begins before the 70 evenings we read of in Daniel chapter 8, which are the 2.5 months from the 6th trumpet to the 7th trumpet. Therefore he shall be grieved and return to the land of Israel to appear as Antichrist, as we'll see in the next verse, and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant in Jerusalem when he appears as Antichrist at 666 in the midst of Daniel's 70th week, which is now 5 months, as you can see in verse 31. As you can see in the Daniel 11 hypothesis on biblicalresearchlabs.com, the word Chittim, as in the ships of Chittim in Daniel chapter 11 verse 30, can denote cypress, which is most likely the Greek name for the Mediterranean cypress trees, which can live for thousands of years. Look up Mediterranean cypress tree lifespan and see for yourself. And when you look up Chittim in the Strong's Concordance, as you can see from an unused name denoting cypress, and again the etymology of the word cypress being most likely from the Greek word for the Mediterranean cypress tree, and that you'll find in the New World Encyclopedia. And you'll also see in the Companion Bible in the note for Daniel chapter 11 verse 30, Chittim means cypress. Daniel chapter 11 verse 30 being just before 1131, which is when Satan appears as Antichrist, when the 70 evenings, which the 70 years of captivity to Babylon were a type of, begin, the 2.5 months that end when the true Christ returns 3.5 days after the two witnesses are killed, presumably at the end of their 75 days of prophesying, beginning 8.5 days before 666, when they're the two olive trees of Zechariah chapter 4. Then at 666, they become the two candlesticks written of in Revelation chapter 11. And look up the video, The Two Olive Trees and the Two Candlesticks, in the Timelines of Revelation playlist for a more thorough explanation. Moses and Elijah being the two witnesses most likely, and the ships of Chittim written of in Daniel chapter 11 verse
verse 30, in my opinion. It's also possible the armies which were in heaven that return with Christ at the seventh trumpet that you can read of in Revelation chapter 19 are the ships that shall come from the coast of Chittim also, that you can read of in Numbers 24, in addition to Moses and Elijah. Again, the Mediterranean cypress tree being known for its lifespan of thousands of years, the armies which were in heaven being made up of the apostles and the prophets of old who lived thousands of years ago, just as Moses and Elijah did, who are told to come up hither when they're resurrected just before the seventh trumpet sounds. And notice it says in Numbers chapter 24, verse 24, they shall afflict Asher, which means the Assyrians, Satan's role of Antichrist, and shall afflict Eber, his one world system, being on the opposing side in the battles of Armageddon and Hamongog, and he also shall perish forever, Satan being the son of perdition, called the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit and goes into perdition, and that happens after the 1,000 years are finished. But going back to Daniel chapter 11 verse 30, which is just before Satan appears as Antichrist, again 8.5 days according to my calculations, as far as the two olive trees called in Daniel chapter 11 verse 30 the ships of Chittim, denoting Cyprus as in the Mediterranean cypress trees known to live for thousands of years, because you have to add the 3.5 days before the seventh trumpet to the 75 days, the time the prophesying of the two witnesses has been shortened to, and 75 minus 70 is 5, add 3.5 and you get 8.5 days. So with the two witnesses written of in Revelation chapter 11 being most likely Moses and Elijah, who just like the Mediterranean cypress trees are thousands of years old, these are also ships as in the highly polished spectrum metal vehicles, the flying vehicles that we know of from the book of Ezekiel. And again, hypothetically, the rest of the ships of Chittim are the armies which were in heaven that return with Christ at the seventh trumpet. The rest of the 7,000 Zadok, that is to say, the positive to the negative, that are Satan's angels, who are cast to earth at the beginning of the 5-month-long hour of temptation, who are then destroyed at the end of the 5 months when the true Christ returns with the armies which were in heaven at the woe of the seventh trumpet. Having covered the one world political system that emerges at the beginning of the 5-month-long hour of temptation in verses 21 through 30, and the religious system that emerges after the deadly wound to the political system whenever Satan appears as the false Christ in verses 31 through 45, we now back up to verses 16 through 20 and the predecessors to that final one world system, with really the theme of Daniel 11 being the history of globalism. So beginning with verse 16, we now rewind for a closer look at the first two attempts at one world government, first with the League of Nations in verses 16 through 19, followed by the United Nations in verse 20. But he that cometh against him shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land which by his hand shall be consumed. And here we see the League of Nations personified. The glorious land here is, of course, the land of Israel, and it was Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, along with the Balfour Declaration, that paved the way for the fig tree generation to begin in 1948, with the State of Israel coming into being. Kenite-occupied Israel in 1948, recognized by both the King of the South, the United States, that is to say, Manasseh, as well as the King of the North in 1948. The United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers, that is to say, Jacob and Esau. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him, talking about the League of Nations here. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her. But she shall not stand on his side, neither before him. When you look up this word daughter in your Strong's Concordance, you will find over and over again, daughter of Zion, daughter of Jerusalem, daughter of Judah, daughter of my people, Jerusalem. And again, Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations was mandatory Palestine. After this, he shall turn his face unto the isles, and shall take many. The League of Nations had 42 founding members, excluding the United States of America. 16 of them left or withdrew from the international organization. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was the only founding member to leave the League,
and return to it later and remain so a member until the end. In the founding year, 6 other states joined. Only 2 of them would have a membership that lasted until the end. In later years, 15 more countries joined. 3 memberships would not last until the end. Egypt was the last state to join in 1937. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, ESOL that is to say, the King of the North, was expelled from the League on December 14, 1939. 5 years after it joined on September 18, 1934. Iraq was the only member of the League that at one time was a League of Nations mandate. Iraq became a member in 1932 according to the New World Encyclopedia. But a prince for his own behalf shall cause the reproach offered by him to cease. Without his own reproach, he shall cause it to turn upon him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fort of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and not be found. With the covenant of the League of Nations originating in the Paris Peace Conference, a look at what happened to France during World War II illustrates what a failed attempt at peace this was. When World War breaks out, it's safe to say the attempt at world peace was a failure, but it did provide the skeletal structure for the next attempt at world peace, the United Nations. And verse 20 of Daniel chapter 11 reads as follows, Then shall stand up in his estate, in the estate of the League of Nations, according to this hypothesis, a raiser of taxes in the glory of the kingdom, but within few days he shall be destroyed, neither in anger nor in battle. The Interlinear Bible by J.P. Green translates this verse as, Then one who sends a tax exactor shall stand in his place. So we're not talking about a raiser of taxes, but one who sends a raiser of taxes for the glory of the kingdom, but within a few days he will be broken, but not in anger and not in battle. And again, from the New World Encyclopedia, the UN is an international organization established in 1945 for the purpose of securing world peace. It replaced its predecessor, the League of Nations, which had failed to prevent war between nations. It was founded by 51 nations led by the Allied powers after World War II. This time with Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh as members, with the UN headquarters even in the land of Manasseh, New York City that is to say, where there's a heavy sprinkling of Kenites, incidentally. The United Nations would for many decades forcefully hammer out the infrastructure of the future New World Order via all 4 hidden dynasties: education, economics, politics, and religion, with President Bush proclaiming on January 16, 1991, "This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War. We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. So then who is this raiser of taxes the United Nations sends? Remember to think global as far as this chapter is concerned. You could even subtitle it The History of Globalism, as in a global carbon tax. So that brings us up to current time as far as Daniel 11:20 is concerned, the United Nations being, in my opinion, the one who sends out the raiser of taxes, speaking of the global carbon tax. But we're still not in the one world political system written of in verses 21 through 30. That doesn't emerge until the woe of the 5th trumpet, whenever all 4 of the beasts written of in Daniel 7 emerge out of the sea: the lion, the bear, the leopard, and Daniel's 4th beast. And as it's written in the 21st verse of Daniel chapter 11, "And in his estate, in the estate of the United Nations, which stood up in the estate of the League of Nations, shall stand up a vile person in the one world political system, the dragon, Satan, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries." That's deception. This vile person is Satan himself, once he's cast from heaven to the earth at the woe of the 5th trumpet. As it's written in Revelation 12, starting with verse 7, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceived the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So Daniel 11:21 through 30 covers the first half of the 5 months, the political, beginning with Satan and his angels being cast to the earth at the woe of the fifth trumpet, and Daniel 11:31 through 45 covers the religious system, the last half of the 5-month period. There are 4 stages of the locust army given in the book of Joel. In the Hebrew, they are the Nar, the Swarmer, the Devourer, and the Consumer. The locust army are exclusively the fallen angels, so these 4 stages would have to occur during the 5 months. The first 3 stages most likely occur in the first half of the hour of temptation. The 4th and final stage begins when Satan appears at the 6th seal, the 6th trumpet, and the 6th vial. The entire timeline of the 5-month-long hour of temptation is outlined in Daniel 9:27, where it says, "And he, Satan, shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. And in the midst of the week, which is the 6th seal, the 6th trumpet, and the 6th vial, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease." These sacrifices nowadays being sacrifices of love and of our time through Christ to the Father. He'll cause that to cease because they'll cease to worship the true Christ. They'll begin to worship the devil at that time. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, because he's the desolator, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. And this covenant is the covenant of a one-world political system. That first beast written of in Revelation 13, where the first verse, properly translated, makes it totally clear that the one-world political system does not emerge until Satan and his angels are cast from heaven to the earth at the woe of the 5th trumpet. And it reads as follows, being properly translated. Check this out in your companion Bible. "And the dragon stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the names of blasphemy." And remember, those 10 horns were part of Daniel's 4th beast, which is exclusively supernatural. And if you read Daniel 7 carefully, you'll see that that 4th beast is sentenced to perish. Only Satan and his angels are damned. Everybody else has an opportunity during the millennium to get their act together and stand against Satan after the 1,000 years are finished, whereby they don't go into the lake of fire, where they are blotted out of existence. And as it's written in Revelation 17:12, these 10 fallen angel kings receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast, the 5-month-long hour of temptation. The reason this one-world political system is so successful at first may be due to the flying vehicles of the fallen angels written of in Revelation chapter 9, verse 9, being used to portray a clear and present external threat to the human race, causing all nations to join together in a one-world government to quote-unquote save the world.
Having covered verses 16 through 20 in the previous appendix to the Daniel 11 hypothesis, which had to do with the League of Nations in verses 16 through 19 and the United Nations in verse 20, we come now to Appendix 5 in verses 13 through 15, which in my opinion began with Russia's entry into Syria on September 30th, 2015, and continue up until the woe of the 5th trumpet, coinciding with Daniel chapter 11 verse 20 and the breaking of the great horn of the he-goat, which is the same thing as the destruction of the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20, with Daniel 11:21 being when the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins at the woe of the 5th trumpet, when Satan and his angels are cast to earth. But going back to September 30th, 2015, the king of the north shall return, the Russian Federation being the 3rd king of the north, with the United States being the 3rd king of the south. Jacob and Esau fought together from the womb, literally, as you can see in Genesis 25. So when the king of the north entered into Syria, there's been increasing tension ever since, perpetuated mainly by the hidden dynasty of education on both sides, the propaganda being electronically transmitted throughout the world. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south, the United States that is to say, and this will escalate now, especially with the U.S. cutting funding to the World Health Organization in the middle of a global pandemic, even though it's really a plague of the mind by way of deception more than anything else. But regardless, many will stand up against the United States again, and cutting funding to the World Health Organization is also another step toward breaking the great horn of the he-goat, which is the United Nations. That's the strategy laid out on the last page of the grand chessboard also, as well as perpetuating America's own dominant position. The Federal Reserve can print dollars out of thin air, which is the global reserve currency. currency. So there you have the hidden dynasty of economics, and a global economic crash would then basically reset Bretton Woods, pushing any competition back to square one. Remember, Russia, China, and Iran were talking about ditching the dollar in the past several years. That's now basically impossible. Also, the robbers of thy people shall exalt themselves to establish the vision of a new world order, that is to say, but they shall fall. And if you look up that word in the Hebrew, in this case it means to fail. There will be no one world political system until the woe of the fifth trumpet, when Satan and his angels are cast to earth. Daniel's fourth beast is exclusively supernatural, and it's only when the great horn of the he-goat is broken, so to speak, that the four notable ones you can read of in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8 rise up together at the same time in the so-called New World Order, beginning Revelation chapter 13, the four notable ones being the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7. So you'll see the robbers of thy people, which is what the he-goat symbolizes, attempt to bring the one world system into being, but they shall fail. You can already see the United Nations attempting it on its own by calling for 10% of the world's GDP to build itself back up economically, but they shall fail. And for an overview of the continuous weakening of the United Nations, this article from Foreign Policy titled "Trump Stealthily Seeks to Choke Off Funding to UN Programs" will give you an idea of what happened up to October 2018 with the continuous weakening or breaking of the United Nations. More recently, Trump pulled the United States out of the UN Arms Treaty, and again, cutting funding to the World Health Organization as part of the breaking of the Great Horn of the He-Goat, because it's part of the United Nations. And once it's finally broken, so to speak, is when the dragon will stand on the sand of the sea, as Revelation chapter 13 verse 1 should read. The dragon being that old serpent called the devil and Satan. So then it's common sense that he would have to be cast to earth before the one world system can emerge, and his angels will be cast out with him, as it's written in Revelation chapter 12 verse 9. And according to Newsweek, on April 12th, Russia said the world no longer trusts the U.S. to lead. It's time for others to step in to stop blackmail and pressure. So there again, many shall stand up against the king of the south, which is the United States, Russia being the king of the north, who is also at this time putting together the Ezekiel 38 Confederacy, including Red China, no doubt, and that's the confederacy that will become the bear of Daniel chapter 7 at the woe of the fifth trumpet, when the he-goat becomes the leopard and Ephraim, Judah, and Manasseh become the lion, the fourth king of the south of Daniel chapter 11, and the three horns, which are symbolic of the Christian nations of the world, up until they're plucked up by the roots at 666, when Satan appears as Antichrist, which is in verse 31 of Daniel chapter 11. They're no longer Christian nations from that point forward, because they'll begin worshiping the devil instead of Christ, which is what Antichrist means, instead of Christ. So going back to verse 15 of Daniel chapter 11, the arms of the south shall not withstand, meaning the global political system that shall emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet cannot be stopped, no matter which chosen people, so to speak, which means elected officials, are voted into power. After the great horn of the he-goat is broken, the woe of the fifth trumpet occurs when the so-called New World Order rises up out of the sea, so to speak, which is symbolic of peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. The great horn of the he-goat being the same thing as the one who sends a raiser of taxes in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20. The United Nations, in my opinion. And once that's broken, so to speak, the dragon, who is called the vile person in Daniel chapter 11 verse 21, will give the New World Order its power and seat and great authority, as you can see in Revelation chapter 13, when he confirms the covenant with many for 1 week, which was 7 years, but has now been shortened to 5 months. And after the deadly wound written of in Revelation 13, Satan appears as Antichrist at 666, the desolator, as you can see in Daniel chapter 11 verse 31 also, beginning the woe of the sixth trumpet. Then the last 5 verses of Daniel chapter 11 cover what happens when the true Christ returns at the woe of the seventh trumpet, when the battles of Armageddon and Hamon-Gog transpire and the day of the Lord begins, and the true Christ returns at that time as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The king of the south shall be strong, and one of his princes, Ephraim, which is the British Commonwealth, ruled over by the house of Windsor, and he shall be strong above him and have dominion. His dominion shall be a great dominion. His seed shall become a multitude of nations, being the prophecy concerning Ephraim, as you can see in Genesis chapter 48 verse 19. And in the end of years they shall join themselves together for the king's daughter of the south, that is to say the scepter of Judah, which is now in London, England, the house of Saxe, Coburg, and Gotha, now being called the House of Windsor, shall come to the King of the North to make an agreement. The Treaty of London in 1915 between England and Tsarist Russia before it became the Soviet Union. France and Italy taking part in the treaty as well. Tsar Nicholas II being of the royal seed of Judah as well, the cousin of King George V, the King of England. But she, the king's daughter, which means the scepter of Judah, shall not retain the power of the arm in Tsarist Russia, which is the first king of the north, that is to say, neither shall he stand nor his arm. Tsar Nicholas would be murdered in the Bolshevik Revolution, but she, the scepter of Judah in Tsarist Russia, shall be given up, and they that brought her, the Romanov dynasty, and he that begat her. In other words, the Soviets would throw God out of Russia, so to speak, creating an atheistic dictatorship, and he that strengthened her, Christ, that is to say. The Romanovs were a Christian dynasty of the king line of Judah, but as it's written in Amos chapter 2 verse 1, Moab burned the bones of the king of Edom into lime. Ammon and Moab being symbolic of the two wings of communism in the ultimate futurist sense. But out of a branch of her roots shall one stand up in his estate, which shall come with a mighty army, and shall enter into the fortress of the king of the north, and shall deal against them, and shall prevail. In the Bolshevik Revolution, when the first king of the north, which was Tsarist Russia, was destroyed and replaced with the USSR, the second king of the north, out of a branch of her roots, meaning the Bolshevik Revolution, which was orchestrated by the Kenites from Wall Street through the United States, which came from the United Kingdom, and shall also carry captives into Egypt, which is symbolic of bondage, their gods with their princes and with their precious vessels of silver and gold, and shall continue more years than the king of the north. So the king of the south shall come into his kingdom and shall return into his own land, signifying the end of World War I. So here we see the end of the description of the first king of the south, the United Kingdom and the British Commonwealth during World War I, Ephraim being one of the horns on the ram we saw in Daniel chapter 8. Next we'll see the second king of the south, Germany, which is Judah, in the Second World War. And remember, the result of the First World War was the League of Nations, and the result of the Second World War was the United Nations, which is the great horn of the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8. But his son shall be stirred up, and shall assemble a multitude of forces, and one shall certainly come and overflow and pass through. Then shall he return and be stirred up even to his fortress, and the king of the south shall be moved with choler, Germany being the notable horn of the he-goat in Daniel chapter 8, not the great horn, but the notable horn used by the Kenites in the world wars to bring about the great horn of the he-goat at the end of World War II, the United Nations. You'll see this word choler in Daniel chapter 8 verse 7 as well, and remember the last verse of Isaiah chapter 9 where it says, Manasseh Ephraim and Ephraim Manasseh, and they together shall be against Judah. And so it was in both world wars. And the king of the south shall be moved with choler, and shall come forth and fight with him, even with the king of the north, Soviet Russia. And he shall set forth a great multitude, but the multitude shall be given into his hand. And when he hath taken away the multitude, his heart shall be lifted up, and he shall cast down many 10,000s, but he shall not be strengthened by it. And you can read about the aftermath of World War II in the book of Obadiah. The king of the south in 1945 becoming Manasseh, which is the United States, who was used by the Kenites to bring about the United Nations that same year, which was when the third trumpet of Revelation chapter 8 began to sound. And in 1948, Kenite-occupied Israel came into being, which is when the fourth trumpet began to sound. 21 years later, in 1969, the fifth trumpet began to sound, 5 being grace in biblical numerics. And in my opinion, Russia's entry into Syria in 2015 is where Daniel chapter 11 verse 13 fast forwards to, and this is all gone into in greater detail in the Daniel 11 hypothesis on biblicalresearchlabs.com. For the king of the north shall return, the third king of the north, which is the Russian Federation, and shall set forth a multitude greater than the former, and shall certainly come after certain years with a great army and with much riches. And in those times there shall many stand up against the king of the south, the United States, at this point in the chapter, the other horn of the ram back in Daniel chapter 8. Also the robbers of thy people, the he-goat of Daniel chapter 8, shall exalt themselves to establish the vision, but they shall fall. Those who claim to be of Judah and are not, but do lie, that goat fig nation, who through their 4 hidden dynasties operate out of all the nations of the world, twisting reality in the minds of the biblically illiterate. It's a Kenite-occupied planet in all reality, so don't deceive yourself by focusing exclusively on one geographic location. So the king of the north, the Russian Federation, shall come and cast up a mountain and take the most fenced cities Christ, not just in Syria, but globally also, with communistic atheism by stealth through politics and the left-right paradigm symbolized by Ammon and Moab. And also at this time, we see what will become the bear of Daniel chapter 7 formulating, which is the Ezekiel 38 confederacy. And the arms of the south shall not withstand, neither his chosen people, the elected officials Americans think will save them from globalism, you could even say, neither shall there be any strength to withstand. The New World Order, as it's called, cannot be stopped because it's the one world political system of Revelation 13.
Well, there's plenty of young people in the United States that have their alarm set early this morning. That's because they're going to be heading on these climate strikes. And this is a map showing whereabouts in the US these are going to be taking place. But let's just zoom out and you can see that this is certainly part of a wider movement.
As you can see in verse 15 of Daniel chapter 11, the arms of the south shall not withstand. The king of the south at this point in Daniel chapter 11 being the United States, called Manasseh prophetically, which means forgetful or causing to forget, neither his chosen people, his elected officials, neither shall there be any strength to withstand the one world political system coming into being at the woe of the fifth trumpet. After the great horn of the he-goat is broken, so to speak, which is the same word in the Hebrew as destroyed in Daniel chapter 11 verse 20, the one who sends a raiser of taxes being the subject of Daniel chapter 11 verse 20, not the raiser of taxes, but the one who sends a raiser of taxes, the United Nations, the great horn of the he-goat written of in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8, the Paris Climate Agreement being an agreement within the United Nations framework, Convention on Climate Change, and the ultimate eventuality of that obviously is a global carbon tax, a raiser of taxes. You have to think global when it comes to Daniel chapter 11 or you're not going to understand. And the Paris Climate Agreement went into effect November 4th, 2016, just before the presidential election, after which the candidate chosen announced on June 1st, 2017, the United States would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. But the earliest date the U.S. can withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement is November 4th, 2020, the day after the presidential election of that year. But again, the subject of Daniel 11:20 isn't the raiser of taxes, but rather the one who sends a raiser of taxes, as you can see in the Green's Interlinear, as well as many other translations, including a book co-authored by James Strong, who put together the Strong's Concordance called the Book of the Prophet Daniel. On page 246, one that causeth an exactor of taxes to pass over, or one that sendeth out a driver. The driver to the ornament of the kingdom was obviously a collector of money or of tribute, taxes, a global carbon tax in my opinion. And the one who sent the Paris Climate Agreement was the United Nations, the great horn of the he-goat you can read of in Daniel chapter 8 verse 8. And once the great horn is broken, so to speak, the 5-month-long hour of temptation begins when the four notable ones, which are the four beasts of Daniel chapter 7, emerge at the woe of the fifth trumpet. Then at the time of the end of the 5-month-long hour of temptation, that is to say, shall the king of the south, which at this point in the chapter means all who will be standing against Satan and his one world system. The king of the south, as in those who are waiting for the true Christ to return, shall push at him. They'll stand against the Antichrist, and the king of the north shall come against him. The king of the south, that is to say, the Ezekiel 38 confederacy, will come against those rebelling against the one world system like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, as you can see in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. The battle of the valley of Hamon-Gog at the very end of the hour of temptation, when the true Christ returns at the seventh trumpet. And he, the true Christ, upon his return shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. Christ being the true Passover lamb, who returns with the armies of heaven, who are the rest of the 7,000 Zadok who lived and died throughout the centuries. He, that is to say the true Christ, shall enter also into the glorious land, which is Jerusalem, where the battle of Armageddon takes place, and many countries shall be overthrown. And here many means all, Christ being that stone that smites the image of Daniel chapter 2 upon its feet, destroying Satan's one world system as well as his role of Antichrist, as you can see in Revelation chapter 19 verse 20. But these shall escape out of his hand, out of the hand of the king of the south, Jacob, that is to say, also known as Israel, the true Christian nation, which is not of this world, even Edom and Moab, and the chief, which which is Rosh in the Hebrew, of the children of Ammon. Esau breaks Jacob's yoke from his neck when he shall escape out of his hand at the seventh trumpet, when all flesh is done away with. Esau being symbolic of the flesh man, hence the communistic atheism, which is humanism. Jacob, whose name was Israel, being symbolic of the spiritual man, those who believe upon the true Christ. All flesh being destroyed at the seventh trumpet, when Edom is destroyed from being a nation forever. It's only when Esau is destroyed from being a nation that the yoke of Jacob is broken from his neck and he escapes out of Jacob's hand. Every stitch of Genesis 27 verses 39 and 40 being a curse upon all who are against Christ. When it shall be that Esau shall fight in the battle of the valley of Hamongog, he shall break Jacob's yoke from off his neck, because that's when all flesh is destroyed, Edom being symbolic of the flesh man. But their souls will be prolonged until the 1,000 years are finished, as we know from Daniel chapter 7 verses 11 and 12. Moab and Ammon being mentioned here because they symbolize the two wings of atheistic communism, humanism that is to say, which will be destroyed whenever all flesh is destroyed. He, which is the true Christ, at the seventh trumpet shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver. Those who were still part of the lion and the bear, the gold and silver on the image of Daniel 2 symbolizes, you could even say, and over all the precious things of Egypt, pointing toward Isaiah chapter 19 verses 19 and 20. Christ shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, which means all the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape.